So, electricity. Let's just set the stage a little bit for radio. Again, we're talking about electronic media from now on, starting with radio, then TV, then internet, then mobile. Radio. Here's an early one, not the earliest. Here it's at least starting to be mass produced and sold to households all over the country. Of course, the one in the middle there is an early transistor radio. Original radio technology relies on tubes in the back of the radio to do magical things, and some wonderful inventors found a way for things called transistors to take the place of these bulky tubes, and so radio technology becomes portable. And I don't know exactly when the first transistor radio, I should. I'm going to say it's 1950s. And then as we go forward to today, audio programming content of a certain kind is called a podcast. By the way, I think that's a brilliant marketing brand name, category name for these things. Came up with a whole new word, which just makes it sound kind of hip and with it. And if I were to ask you guys, if you were all in the classroom, to raise your hands if you listen to podcasts or to a podcast regularly, I bet something like half of you would raise your hands. But guess what? It's radio. Slightly different technology used, but radio. And as you know, I am enamored of linking advances in media types to advances in technology. So I'm just going to, beat this poor horse, once or twice more. And AC and DC electricity current, use of radio waves, the invention of the telephone, then the ability to send sound and picture by radio waves is TV, the internet, and then mobile phones. Those are the advances, major advances in technology that spiked changes in media type. So, guys, our agenda for this radio lecture is to start with, what is it? How and why did it develop as it did? What is its role in the media mix? These are the things we'll be talking about overall today. And we'll start with the beginning of electronic communications with the telegraph. Talk a little bit about the telephone and then the invention of radio. And as we do that, we'll talk about telegraph's uses in the Civil War. Then we'll talk about Edison versus Tesla in terms of AC versus DC current, and Marconi versus Tesla in terms of who invented and who was capable or who did the first radio broadcast. And we'll talk about, as the technology gained steam in the U.S., who were the companies that started to put together radio stations and radio networks. We'll listen to early radio content, almost up to the current time. We'll talk about the impact of the automobile on the radio business, and of course it was significant. Then it's important enough so that I list it here as an agenda item, but radio, because it is only sound, means that one's mind is engaged in basically creating pictures, mental pictures to go with the sounds. And so, and your imagination is the limit, and there are no limits, right, to what can be portrayed by a sound, what sort of mental image your mind can get from it. So even though we have here with radio an impression that is missing vital elements to creating sort of the best impression or the ideal impression, because it's missing some elements, your mind tends to supply them, which means that there's some engagement and that it can help with persuasion. We'll talk about the radio business, the key companies. We'll also spend a fair amount of time talking about the Radio Advertising Bureau, the RAB, which is the industry's lobbying marketing arm. All media types have these. Remember, with Out of Home, it was Outdoor Advertising Association of America. Magazines, it was the MPA, Magazine Publishers Association. Newspapers were pretty weak on that front, I think, actually. And then we'll say a bit about the future. And as I say, this may end up being divided into 2 lectures. We'll just kind of see as we go along. The second electronic medium. And there is a picture of a bunch of adults. Don't see any kids, but I think in the typical household of the day. And this looks more like a business meeting of some kind, of a bunch of people looking at. They're looking at the radio as if they're going to see something, and listening to the radio. And that's a big piece of furniture there, as I said, lots of tubes and things. And these early radios, as they were bought by families, did tend to be pretty big pieces of furniture, big speakers, etc. If it were a family we were looking at after dinner, I think you'd see some kids, on the floor on their stomachs, listening, propping up their heads with their arms, and everybody listening to who knows what, to music, being broadcast from a ballroom with a swing band of some kind, and some, people dancing maybe, or you'd imagine people were dancing, or you're listening to a comedy show with all these different characters and sound effects. Basically what we think of as a sitcom today was first broadcast for the radio. Might have been a game show. There were game shows first on the radio. It might have been news, of course. Might have been a drama, a spooky, scary suspense program. And many of these, the first advertisers would sponsor the whole program. That's how it started off in the beginning, as opposed to, separate ads throughout the program. What is the first electronic medium? So you guys know by now I like definitions. So radio is, as you can see here, transmission and reception of electromagnetic waves of radio frequency, especially those carrying sound messages. Cellular phones are linked by radio rather than wires. A radio is also, as a noun, is an apparatus for receiving radio programs. She turned on the radio. I think it's now going to be time. I want us to think about the fact that with radio, you could send a message, and even with the first electronic medium, which we haven't really talked about yet too much, we're about to, the telegraph. You could send messages, hundreds and hundreds of miles, almost instantaneously. And to think about what a amazing development that was for humankind and communication, responding to emergencies and just being aware of what's going on around us. And remember that the first newspapers, the news from Europe and the colonies was 2 months old because it traveled over on a ship. That's how long it took to cross the Atlantic. But the first telegraph wire, which we'll talk about in a minute, changed all that in terms of the immediacy of news. So I'm now going to take a little break, and we're going to play a scene that you can even see here highlighted, but I'm going to play it anyway to show you one of the methods of long-distance communication before the telegraph, before electricity.